just so important for cultural services also. But the reality is springs are drying across the region, in the Hindu-Kush Himalaya region. As a result, it's having a huge implication on the water security, particularly during the lean seasons. If people are finding it very difficult to fetch water, and if they are depending on springs or spring-fed streams. Interestingly, most of the pipe supply schemes now, we have the schemes where water needs to be reaching to every household. And many of them are linked to springs or spring sheds. So if springs are drying up, the whole system, sustainable, system of water supplies to the people or even for the biodiversity is declining. We find that there is a wildlife and human conflicts happening because springs and the spring-fed water bodies are drying in many places. So animals have to go to fetch water somewhere else, and they'll go near settlements, a farming system where water is available. So it has a lot of implications, I think. But the good news is that there is an increasing traction towards springs in these countries, including India, Bhutan, Nepal, and now also Bangladesh, Pakistan as well. There Indus. If you look at the Indus Basin, most of the water supply is coming from groundwater. Groundwater is the main source. And a lot of it is actually also coming from the cryosphere region. And if that whole infiltration of the snow melt and glacier-fed streams are drying up, it has huge implications for millions of people.
Definitely, sir. But we're trying to address, could you tell us that all of what you said is completely valid and we need to be cognizant of this, that they are how crucial they are. But could you list down some factors for our audience? Because just for their knowledge, that what are these factors that come into play when we're talking of which contribute to the reason why these springs are drying up?
Factors are multiple. Of course, climate change is one of them. And when we say climate change, it relates to the erratic rainfall. We are experiencing long dry spells. This time, winter has been very dry in many countries of this region. Right. Of course, erratic and more intense rain comes, which means the water flows off. It doesn't infiltrate to the extent it would if the rainfall were gentle, and it continued for a longer time like in the past. But also the warming, the evapotranspiration rates are increasing due to the warming trend. So that also is a factor. But beyond climate change, the major also factors are the way land use and land cover changes are happening, which means the forest degradation is one of the reasons, deforestation. We're seeing a lot of forest fires, which also has impact. Very important is the way infrastructure is developing. See, we have to understand the hydrogeological cycle when it comes to springs. The precipitation needs to infiltrate into the ground, which then emerges in the form of spring. Now, if there is a barrier to the infiltration process through concretization of the way land use systems are happening, then we will not see, springs running as they would in the past. And examples can be many. There were a lot of traditional ponds in Nepal and also many other hill regions. Now, these traditional ponds served also as recharge ponds. They're called as buffalo ponds or others, khals. Now, they have been converted into playing grounds. There are some infrastructure has come up. So how does the infiltration process happen? It's hindered. Likewise, road construction is also another major factor. The way roads are constructed without considering the aquifer systems, in which aquifer means where the rocks and the soils they combine and store water. If you cut across the aquifers, which actually are linked to springs, that the springs are also cut off. So the way road infrastructure is happening in the Hindu-Kush Himalaya region is a very conventional, also from a plains kind of perspective, road construction approach. There, greener approaches, which also consider the aquifer systems, need to be taken into account. And of course, the innovations are required, but that's also another factor. In the Hindu Kush Himalaya, it's a seismically active zone. So we do have earthquakes. A major earthquake here in Nepal and surrounding area we experienced in 2015. So a lot of aquifer shook off, got shaken. And as a result, many springs also dried up. But at the same time, a few springs also, emerged. I think that seismic activities is also another factor which is leading to drying up of springs. And lastly, I would say the way spring water and Springshed management are being managed, the governance aspects. The demand is increasing, springs are drying. As a result, deep boring wells are coming up. And they all are part of the common aquifer from which springs also emerge. Now, the more water one extracts through deep bore wells, etc., actually has an impact also on the spring depletion. It's a connected, aquifer system. So there are multiple reasons, and of course, there are direct reasons, and the indirect is, of course, the lack or inadequate policies enabling conditions to actually revive springs. And these enabling conditions can be in many forms, either through policy, frameworks which are lacking. Springs have been invisible, like the groundwater, and that's the major problem. Once springs do become visible at the policy, at practice as well as science level, I'm sure the move towards reviving springs will accelerate in the coming times. Yeah.
If I could just kind of address, I request you to address the fundamental block of how is a spring formed? Like, if you could just do that for the audience. I believe there are about 50 people, 50 plus people attending this particular podcast. So if you could just break it down for us, how is the spring exactly formed? And also, if I can add a question to that, can we create springs through artificial processes?
Okay. Well, I think if as a botanist I can explain how springs are formed, I'm sure many would be able to understand. So spring formation, first is we have to understand the whole hydrological cycle. If you look above, we get the rains, we get snowfall, we get other forms of dew and whatever. Now that would come and fall on the surface, on the land, right? Now once it falls there, a lot of it actually runs off on the surface, just goes into streams or river systems. But a lot of it actually goes inside the earth, and the inside the earth can vary depending on the land use system. In the forest systems, you might have a better infiltration if it's a good forest. Likewise, if there are ponds, etc., it will go into the earth. So the water then goes inside the earth. And that's where the magic happens. Inside the earth, if you look at, if we walk across the roads, we'll see a lot of rock structures, right? And these are different types of rocks, as we have understood. It could be sedimentary, metamorphic, igneous, whatever. But these rock formations and also the soil formations come together and they form a conglomerate which is called as the aquifer. And these also have the pores inside, spaces between the rock structures. Now, that's where the water is actually stored. Now, but each rock types has three key elements which we need to understand. It has a storability potential. So how much water it can store can vary from one rock type to another. Then it has transmittivity. So water is transmitted through the rocks and it flows down. So obviously through a gravity kind of system, it has to continue to flow. And then is also the permissibility. So how much is, all these three factors actually combine to tell how the water will flow through the rock systems. Now, the water flowing has to find a way to emerge out, and it emerges on the land where it may be a slightly weaker point may be there. So it just comes out either in a concentrated form, which we call as a spring, which can be called in local names like Dhara or Nola, as you call in Indian context. It's called Mool in Nepal. It's called a Chashmas in many other places. Or it can be in the form of, this image will show that. Or it can be form of many seepages. So that's how the water, comes out. And one spring and a cluster of springs may occur. So that's the whole science behind it. Now, whether an artificial spring can be formed or not, if you understand this system of aquifer, how the water moves, from where it moves, I think it's possible to form artificial springs as well. I know there are places in Afghanistan where I worked where people could identify areas where springs could be actually, created. But there are so many springs already. I think if they are managed well, I think there is no need for new springs unless, of course, there is an acute shortage of water in some places. So that's the size of it. But if you want me to elaborate on the aquifers, I can go to that as well, which is also an interesting science in itself.
It definitely is interesting, but I think we'll have to, schedule another episode to get into the technical aspects of it.
Okay.
But for now, what you mentioned that it's all interlinked, like the hydrogeological cycle, where rainfall and groundwater rechargeability sort of affects how much water a spring will have or how a spring will emerge. So based on the similar lines, we've heard of something called watersheds, but I believe there's something that's also called a spring shed. So could you also elaborate about that? What exactly are spring sheds, and then what is the difference between a spring shed and a watershed?
Okay. If you go back to the image which you were just showing with the recharge, area. So watershed basically is what we call as more a surface. If you look at this, you see the village 2 is there and there is a village 1 below. If we have to take a conventional watershed approach, we'll call it a ridge to valley approach. Let's say from village 2 to village 1 would be one kind of a watershed. Of course, watershed had many criteria as well. It can be a large basin, it can be subcatchment, it can be micro watershed. So that's a different debate. But basically, we are looking at how the water flows on the surface and then emerges into a common outlet downstream.
Right.
But if you look at the aquifer here in this image, that's the important science which differentiates springshed from a watershed. Because if a spring is near the village 1 in a watershed, if you see the aquifer inclination, actually the recharge area is like at the back of that watershed, in another watershed rather, we can say. So it's not the same watershed approach which can revive a spring, because the recharge area actually, due to the aquifer, configuration, it lies in another watershed. Yeah. So what we are saying is, as a springshed, it's a combination of the watershed, let's say the ridge to valley, but also taking the another valley where the recharge area lies. So it includes the aquifer systems as well. And that's where, the main difference lies in the watershed where the focus is on the surface, systems. But in the Springshed, we also include the aquifer systems to define where the water is coming from, how it is emerging, and that whole area is then called as a Springshed. So we call it a valley to ridge to valley approach when it comes to Springshed management, and not a ridge to just a valley approach.
Right. So then it spans across multiple watersheds.
Absolutely.
And
it can span across multiple watersheds.
Okay. Okay, so
So we wanted to kind of deep dive a little more into, now that we've spoken about the basics and you've explained it to the audience and us as well here. We wanted to understand a little more on the specific work that you've carried out. So I believe that ICIMOD has a specific Springshed management approach, which involves a 6-step protocol for revival of springs. If you could just elaborate on what is the management approach and how is it a little different from other conventional approaches or approaches adopted elsewhere? We could just talk a little more about the protocol.
Yes, I think ICIMOD, yes, we have been working on Springshed management, of course, with partners always. The partners can be the government partners, the civil society, NGOs, academia, and of course, the local communities. In 2018, actually, we co-developed together with Aquadam, the Advanced Center for Water Resources Development Management. I think they have done a pioneer work on Springshed management, bringing the hydrogeology science into this whole, Springshed concepts. So we co-developed a protocol. We call it as maybe I'll just show it. It's called as the Spring Revival Protocol. It's online as well. But let me just go back to, this is not something which we did as a scratch. In India, the state of Sikkim, in decades ago, a program called as Dhara Vikas, the Spring Revival, was launched. And there, this whole science of hydrogeology was already being tested through the Dhara Vikas and validated. What we have done, we have built on that learning. We have brought more learning from the region, from other countries beyond India, and we developed this 6-step protocol, which entails a process right from the beginning of comprehensive mapping of springs and springsheds, which we do by involving the local communities, particularly women as well, because they know much more about springs than men, because they are going to the springs almost every day. Then, of course, is the data monitoring system. So if you're working on with the view to understanding what happens to the springs before and after interventions, then one needs to have a monitoring system. And this data monitoring system we can have for many parameters. One is, of course, the spring flow. So once we have done the interventions, what happens afterwards in terms of the spring flows, then weather data has to be collected, because people will say, well, the spring flow might have increased because there is increase in the rainfall. How can you attribute it to the structural or other measures? So we need that evidence. Water quality is also a very important aspect of springs. And we see a lot of deterioration in the water quality as well, happening due to anthropogenic factors, agrochemicals. So that is another aspect. Understanding
and steps,
yes.
Are these 2 steps, the first and second step, both being done by the community itself? Like, do you
very good point. I think very good point. I think if you look at the data monitoring system, there can be 2 ways of data monitoring. One is the manual way, the other is the automatic systems, weather stations, water sensors, etc. Our approach is to engage the local communities we call as para-socio hydrologists. or para workers or community resource persons who are trained on measuring rainfall, on measuring spring flows. And so local communities are actively engaged in this whole process of monitoring data collection. And we have also started using some digital solution, mobile apps, and training local community resource person to actually apply those techniques. So it's a very much community driven process, but of course always supported by the technical experts. Then comes the gender, social, and governance systems. I think it's important to know who are the users of springs. What kind of dependency is there on the springs? Whether it's only for drinking water, is it for multiple purposes, drinking, domestic, irrigation, cultural, other needs? And what is the gender division of roles? Who's actually fetching water? Who's making decision? What kind of institutional mechanisms are there for managing springs and Springshed, and how inclusive are those? Now, that understanding will lead us to later the step 5, which is about co-designing, management measures for reviving springs, which will not just be technical, but also institutional and social measures. Now, the key, of course, technically speaking, is the step 4, the hydrogeological mapping. This becomes extremely important because we need to know where the recharge areas of the critical springs which we want to, revive lie. They could lie just above the spring. They could lie far away from the spring, depending on how the hydrogeology of that place is. And how we do it, we train, of course, the people. They can collect data, rock types, rock inclines, dips, etc. But those data are then processed through some softwares. But like currently, we use the Coral Draw and the Google Earth softwares to be able to generate 3-dimensional models, which will exactly tell us where the recharge areas of those springs lie, which is very important because we could be doing measures in a place which will not have any impact on the recharge because the recharge area was lying somewhere else, as the hydrogeological assessments would tell us. Now, of course, the scientists, many scientists always say, how have you validated it? Do you know really this field-based methodology works? Is it the right one? So we've also done, we have a project funded by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation in India. Indian Himalayan region is called as the Strengthening Climate Adaptation State Capacities, SCA Himalaya. Through that, we've done the validation through isotopic studies as well. And we have found that actually the field-based methodology is pretty sound. It has been validated even by the isotopic studies, which show that, yes, the recharge areas which were identified through simple methods of hydrogeology actually are within the zones which are also defined by the isotopic studies. Now comes, once we've identified the recharge areas, one would work on the recharge measures. Now the area could be anything. It could be a forest type, which could be managed by communities, which could be managed by states or common resource. It could be an agricultural land. It could be settlements, so that area, once we know, then we have to co-design what kind of measures may be required. And the recharge measures, which can be simple pits, basically not lined concrete pits, but earthen pits which would recharge. It could be many other options also. And more important, the institutional mechanisms have to be put in place, which are inclusive, which engage the women and the marginalized group. And lastly, measuring the impacts, and not just from hydrology, but also from the social, economic, ecological, and cultural aspects. That's how we do it. I think, and for that, ICIBOT has been working with many partners and building capacities of many stakeholders as well on the application of the 6-step protocol.
I think this protocol is quite elaborate, but I think it's neat and very clear through the points of inclusion, through the points of community participation, and focused around not just technical aspects, but also governance level aspects as well, and promoting sensitization and education and awareness. I think it's it's not just the springs that are being revived, but also the communities that are being fostered with knowledge as well. I think I would like to thank you for sharing this particular 6-step protocol. It really helps us understand what SMOD is doing, how they approach the spring shed management with respect to the revival of these springs.
Very quickly, I want to add, we are still, this protocol is still evolving because now the focus is on nature-based solution. We're trying to strengthen the protocol by bringing NBS elements into this. And also we have developed now a gender equality and social inclusion manual, which for spring shed management, which will be part of this 6-step protocol. So that's something still progressing here.
Right.
That sounds great that you're actually catering to an equitable spring shed management approach, I must say. So, but we've discussed now how this spring shed management works, your 6-step protocol, and about your work done to revive these springs. But I'd just like to ask, has the context of these springs been rural in nature, and or have you worked in urban areas as well?
As far as ACMOD programs are concerned, we have mostly worked in the rural areas in terms of reviving springs, right? But in terms of understanding, what's happening to the springs, we had a program which also looked at the springs and how, and from a larger water security perspective as to how much dependency of the urban population is on the springs. And there was a research published. We called it the Highware program, which is not running at the moment. It's completed.
Right.
And there we looked at quite a few hill cities and towns, including Missouri, for instance, in India, where it was found that nearly 9 million liters of water per day is actually coming from nearly 20 springs. So,
Right.
and likewise, you go to Murray town in Pakistan, it's like 60 to 70% of the population actually depends on water which is coming from springs. But rural, we mostly work, and most of our work also on reviving is around the rural context. But urban-rural context, when it comes to spring supplies, is so much blended. A lot of springs actually lie in the rural watersheds, but their water is coming to the urban towns. And there, of course, the incentive mechanisms, we've tried to look now at that as to how do you really incentivize people who are actually managing the spring sheds, but the actual water, services are going to some other communities. And that's an area where we're still working. But urban context will be something we'll be going a little more deeper as we move ahead in the years to come.
Absolutely. I mean, the reason why I asked this was you answered it yourself, that it's these springs in the rural areas that are actually, catering to the supply of urban areas as well. So we know that there are springs in urban areas also. Like, if I might add, I recently went to Darjeeling, and we see that the city in the urban area has a lot of springs, and their main source of water is from these springs. But I was surprised to see that there are springs, they were being overutilized, that one truck, like you have those tankers that were filling up water from those springs, and there are like 5 waiting in line for their turn to be filled. And they're actually fetching water from these, rural areas on the outskirts, and they're bringing it into the main city. So I was actually very shocked that, they're so important, but they're so less talked about, which is why I wanted to understand if the kind of spring shed management approach that you just talked about, if that can be sort of scaled to the urban areas as well. Because in rural areas, like you said, there is a process to sort of map them and figure out where they were and where we lost them. But with the kind of urbanization that has taken place in urban areas, how do you think, is it possible to sort of revive these dried up springs and to actually even map out if there was a spring that was existing there before and isn't now, and what is the kind of approach that we can then adapt to the urban areas to sort of, revive these springs back.
Yeah, that's a very important observation. And my colleagues, Sushmita, Sam, they've just published an article, an op-ed. I think that's something I'll request them to share later. It's from, Darjeeling and Kalimpong, other experiences. But when I went to Kalimpong a few years ago, there was a water tanker which came to the hotel where we were staying, and I asked that person, where do you get the water from? And he said it's from a spring. And I said, okay, we started discussing about that. And I said, what do you do? What would you aspire for? He said, I wish I had a spring in my land. So you see, it was so profitable a business.
Yeah.
So, that's a very important point he said. And I think what I want to emphasize here is the shift of a common resource to a more privatization of this resource, of a common aquifer. And that is happening very rapidly. If you look at in the region, people are buying land and if there is a spring, it belongs to them. I think that's a trend which requires regulations. It requires policy interventions because springs come from aquifer, which is a common resource. It cannot become a private resource. And once that happens, the marginalization of the marginalized happens because they will not have access to water who mostly depend on springs. Now the question becomes, can something be done? Of course, something can be done. It requires a collective action by different stakeholders. It requires enabling policy frameworks, strategies, very clear guidelines. It requires curbing malpractices, which is happening rapidly. And for that, I think there is a need to show good practices, examples that things can be done. And that's what we try to do at ICIMOD. Our role is not we do spring revival everywhere in nook and corner of HKH, but we show good practices, community-led pilots, multi-stakeholder, interdisciplinary approaches are embedded within that. And those become the learning hubs to show, yes, things can work. But if we have our urban water planning happening, I think springs mapping, spring inventory, Springshed management should be part of that whole plans.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry to say, but most civil engineers who are designing water structures are not trained on the Springshed management. They just want to supply water from a spring to the user, but never from the spring to the area where spring recharge is happening. I think that holistic approach is the call of the day, and the sooner the better, because springs are drying rapidly.
Right. We're also keeping check on the time, and we are at the concluding end of the conversation. I think you're absolutely right. I am a civil engineer, and I must agree with what you're saying. I don't think we are we're horse with blinders, which is walking only in one path, which is delivering the water. But where the sources, rejuvenating it, maintaining it is something that there is a disconnect, certainly. And it's a great learning for me, and also a humble side of acceptance that yes, we should do better. And through this conversation with you, Sanjeev sir, I think not just us, but the many participants who are on the podcast have been more sensitized towards the work that you're doing. We are learning about what a spring is and the 6-step methodology as well, and how inclusivity in planning can help us keep a more sustainable practice for the long run. So inclusivity in terms of bringing the local communities to participate in the mapping, monitoring activities so that they can be sensitized, the awareness can be raised, to have a sustainable practice for the long run across both technical and governance related levels through the different phases of the project. I think that is something that which stays with me, because that is a unique approach, because it's not just data driven or driven top down, but it's really about bringing the local communities together collectively, given that they are most of them are heterogeneous settlements with people from different ethnicities, religions, income groups. I think it's very important to have a representative uh, and collective action towards reviving something which is a common and a human right of a resource, which is water. Uh, you want to add something?
I just
Tanya?
like to add, it just came to mind that the more you involve communities, like you mentioned, you do in your work, I think it also gives them a sense of ownership to, sort of maintain and safeguard the resource that they have. So it instills in them that sense to protect and conserve and to judiciously use the resource at their disposal in that way, which is a great approach, and probably it's like a pressing need of the hour as well. So thank you so much, Sanjeev sir. It was great to have you with us, and we look forward to more such interactions on multiple other topics with you. And if time permits, do we have questions that we want to take up?
I think I see 7 of them. Can you 7 questions? Do you have access to those questions?
We can just take up probably 2 or 3 for now. And
Not bad. Yeah. Other questions?
Do you want me to go?
Yes.
no, we'll just
So there are a few questions that have come up. One's from Krishna Srivastav, asking if there is any effort to force recharge in the vicinity of springs during monsoon season to divert flood water from flowing into rivers and sea to subsurface absorption. I think,
very interesting.
yeah, I would also love to know if there is a possibility to do that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think of course floods is a matter of scales also. When we talk of springs, what we do is to harvest the runoff. During rains, it could be from the roads, it could be from other slopes, and harvest it in the ponds, in the pits or the trenches. I think that would lead to storage of water within the catchment, and less runoff downstream. Uh, but also several bioengineering methods are there, which can control the runoff or reduce the runoff flows if there are deep gullies or gullies. So all that also leads to reduction in the flood risks. So yes, it's possible. We do integrate that element within the Springshed management approaches as well. We have some good examples of that. Yeah.
I think there's one comment from Dr. Kothru who mentions that there is also this tapped water sources which are also arriving into the houses, and because of which a lot of the local communities have ended up ignoring this natural resource of local springs, and thus there are very few, if not none, resource persons available in the villages to spread the awareness of spring water flow dynamics and how to maintain it. So it's just I wanted to put it out to all the attendees that this is a comment that's come in, and I think it completely, I mean, I agree with this. Like, we have the privilege of just opening a tap and getting our water. We don't really much bother about where it's coming from.
No, I think Dr. Rajan, we worked together, of course. Yes, it's a very important point. That's what is happening, with taps coming in the households. The springs are being ignored, even though if you ask the women, are springs important? They'll always say yes. They always go to springs because of many, many reasons. Of course, cultural reason is one. If in Uttarakhand or many other states, when people get married, they first go to springs for the blessings. But beyond that, I think many say in winter the spring water is warm, in summer it's a little cold. When pipe supply schemes fail, they go to springs. But there is hardly any programs which would actually, incentivize local communities to also include springshed management and not ignore the springs within the local village. That's a very, very important point Dr. Rajan has pointed out. I don't have more to say on that.
There's one more question that has been mentioned by Prashanto Roy, and the questions is trying to understand what are the mechanisms or strategies through which you can engage respective community in the process of the 6-step methodology, and what challenges are faced and what is the way forward. I think if I can understand it correctly, how do you represent a particular community? How do you decide who
Gets to participate
gets
in the process and who doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, the very first step, as I mentioned, of the 6-step protocol is the inventory, the spring inventory, right? Of course, the area where you would work would depend on many other criteria, whether there is water insecurity in that place, in the water tower or watershed, who are the users, etc. That's on a larger scale. But once you know the spring inventory, what is the dependency of the households on the springs? Who are dependent? Which groups, ethnic groups or caste systems which are there in our region? Who are users of those? Are there any institutional mechanisms? Are women and marginalized included in the institute? That very first steps give you the informed decision as to where one should be focusing on to decide, okay, which are the springs we would like to revive or work upon. And we call them the critical springs. And critical can be not just from a human dimension, they can also be from an ecosystem and biodiversity dimension. Now, how do you engage? I think the engagement process has to be across all the steps. And what we're doing is, as I mentioned in the data collection, we engage the community resource persons, both women and men. That's very important, not just for the generation of data, but people, get to know from their own local resource person how the springs are behaving, what's happening, and they get inspired. There's a greater ownership. Likewise, for hydrogeology, we have para-hydrogeologists who can be involved. But most important is also the institutional mechanisms. There we have to focus on who are the users, which ethnic groups or castes have been excluded, and make a very proactive effort to include them, but always combining with training, sensitization, orientation, cross learning, taking them to places where good practices exist. That inspires the local communities a lot. But of course, there are challenges. I would say one of the challenges is, of course, how do you continue to be having more inclusive gender, social inclusion? That's a process that has to be carried out. But the challenge occurs if the recharge area lies in a private land. Why should a private farmer be ready to give the land or make trenches or whatever if the benefits are going to go to some other community or to the larger community groups? So that incentive, either the incentive mechanisms have to be in place or the recharge measures have to be co-designed so that there are a win-win, not just from the water security point of view, but also from the livelihoods of the people who will be engaged in the Springshed. And so there is, in every step, we feel the involvement of communities is very important. But what we are also doing is the engagement with the local leaders and the local governments. I think that when it comes to Springshed management, they become very important stakeholders. So engaging with them, consulting them to make sure that whatever findings are coming from the local pilots or whatever, feeding into the local government knowledge systems, into their scaling, mainstreaming through programs, budgets. And that we are experiencing very good examples in Nepal, where local municipalities have got inspired by some pilots and they are taking up, Springshed management within their own programs. So there are different ways we can engage the communities. And of course, the whole focus is also now on the climate change adaptation, the local solution. I think Springshed management is a very much local solution which can strengthen the adaptation capabilities of local communities. And therefore, it needs to be scaled and mainstreamed.
Right. So thank you for sharing your inputs and sharing part of your experience. I wish this was a longer call or a longer podcast episode, but I'd like to sincerely thank you for educating us on Springshed management and from the very basic all the way to where we are now, which is at a much higher level of understanding. And I'd like to just say, let's bring it back to life. Yeah. And pass it over to Tanya.
Yeah, so thank you, Sanjeev sir. It was great to have you. And it was great. Thank you to all the viewers also for joining in for this informative session. And stay tuned in to the NIUS social media handles for information regarding the next episode. And thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful interacting with you, and also very interesting questions have come up. I think that's also very important. All the best to Parvat Manthan. I think hope this continues.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. And a sincere thank you to all the attendees who attended the first episode of the podcast. Please stay tuned. We shall be releasing more episodes, as Tanya mentioned, in a systematic and in a soonish manner. Yeah.
Coming soon.
Coming soon. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Namaste, everyone. Bye.
Namaste.